Good morning, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. Thanks again for your patience. I just had a lot going on with my family today, so I was not able to come into work. I'm really sorry, but I did want to do this video for you. So the few things tomorrow, we'll look at some sources and we'll also look at a clip from Shrek to kind of analyze some of the ideas that sit behind the relationships within the Middle Ages, this quote unquote, feudal relationship. And we've already noted a little bit about this, but just to give you some reminders, remember, feudalism is not present everywhere throughout Europe during the Middle Ages, but in some places, and we had been looking at the kingdom of the Franks, that becomes a place where feudalism really does arguably set in, and it's a very decentralized government system, so things just become very, very localized in terms of where decision-making power is, and we see kind of this need for security and protection, and some of this is because, on one hand, the government and the central government is kind of weakening as that starts to occur. There's also all of these invasions from outsiders, whether it be the Vikings, for example, or some other group, and this creates some sort of need for additional security, and society's kind of organizing itself into this situational response, whereby maybe people are coming up with ways to enable there to be some degree of protection. So the nobles and the knights are largely one class that has many different, kind of subcategories, levels of nobles and levels of knights. And within themselves, they're arranging kind of these systems of obligations where pretty much everybody is, beholden to one other person and has other people that, are beholden to them. And so this network of obligations are created through these actual contracts that create these loyalties. And it's that type of system that is enabling, the land titles. It's also enabling the way in which people are going to protect themselves, because nobles are always, exchanging largely land or some other types of benefits, to their vassals, in exchange for some type of commitment for days of time, for fighting, for things like that. And so the security is kind of arranged, in these relationships that we would call these feudal fealty and homage contracts. Of course, about 95% of the population is, is involved in peasantry and is not really involved in holding any type of land title. And, initially, a lot of the nobles acquire their position because they win conflicts and they're like war. They're the people who win the wars. Over time, this becomes hereditary. So we see kind of by the end of the early Middle Ages period, we really see nobles acquiring their titles through hereditary means. And so this noble class becomes very, very exclusive, small, and ultimately, something that, peasants aren't able to really penetrate. And of course, there's another group that's not on this pyramid at all, but should be. This would be kind of a group maybe equal in some degree in power to some nobles and knights, but this would be the people who pray, the clergy or monks, people who are dedicating their lives to the church. And the church and the people who worked in it in this time had a great number of privileges, and they kind of follow their own set of laws. And in some cases, they even oversee some of the behaviors of peasants and knights and whatnot. So the church is really involved in Middle Ages life, and we'll talk about that a little bit. One of the concepts that I just wanted to address today in this video is the concept of chivalry, because, everybody checked out the textbook, and we kind of get this impression that chivalry is very much, about enabling, women to kind of be put on a pedestal, and to some degree, maybe women are elevated because of this chivalric code. And to some degree, that may be the case, but a lot of what chivalry is really about is the behavior of knights and the behavior essentially of, men who are looking at their primary role in society as being those who fight, those who are ultimately the protectors. And kind of what shapes this role is very evident in the chivalric code. So we'll look at some of those. And knights are kind of like the lowest rung of the nobles. Largely, this becomes many people who are vassals to other nobles. And this would be people who train, for a good amount of time throughout their life to become a knight, which is seen as kind of a significant role, especially in the early Middle Ages. In the very early Middle Ages, knights really do play a role of banding together and engaging in a great deal of conflict to protect, the nobles that they are vassals to. In the later Middle Ages, the role of the knight becomes a lot less connected to conflict. We see the growth of cities and other groups kind of obtaining power, groups like merchants, for example, and knights become a little bit marginalized and more of a symbolic role. It's around that time in maybe the high and late Middle Ages where we start to see knights engage in a great deal of games like jousting matches and things like that, because it's a way of showcasing one's skills and one's training in an environment where there's a lot less type of actual conflict, or we even see some ways in which knights engage in conflict in an excessive way that is not necessarily for the purpose of protection. So the role of the knight does change over time. But something that we can look at in the Chivalric Code, and you can kind of see the image of how it's presented, here is this knight with the sword and, kind of protecting this maiden. And we can question this a little bit, because how much is that really the case? This is a chivalric code back from the time period of the 1000s. There were many different codes, so they were not always the same. They varied in terms of time and place. But if we look at this and just take a moment, maybe turn off the sound for a second, just to look at some of the codes and for yourself get a sense, what can these codes that really dictate the behavior of knights, what can they really tell us about, the role of knights in this society, right? What were knights kind of about, and what were they really acting for? And, where do we see some evidence of the knights as like protectors of women? Okay, so take a second to do that, check them out on your own, and then we'll kind of look at them together. So if you have checked them out a little bit, a few of these are kind of interesting, right? And if we look at, thou shalt believe all that the church teaches, and thou shalt observe all of its direction. So we get some sense that the church is kind of directing some of the behavior of knights. Thou shalt defend the church. This is number 2, so it's kind of in terms of priority, pretty important. Thou shalt respect all weaknesses, and shalt constitute thyself the defender of them. Thou shalt love the country in which thou wast born. Thou shalt not recoil before thine enemy. Thou shalt make war against the infidel without cessation and without mercy. Thou shalt perform scrupulously thy feudal duties, if they shall not be contrary to the laws of God. Thou shalt never lie, and shalt remain faithful to thy pledged word. Thou shalt be generous, and thou shalt be champion of the right and good. So if we look at some of these, what is it that's kind of directing the behavior of knights? We don't really see anything in this that speaks to women in particular, but of course, number 3, thou shalt respect all weakness and shalt constitute thyself the defender of them, is really where we see men becoming very much seeing themselves as justified in protecting women, women who are inevitably weak. So this commentary suggests not only maybe were women kind of protected by knights, but this is because women are seen as weak and needing of protection. And that is really kind of more important in a sense to the role of the knight and what the knight is about in terms of kind of, enabling this behavior. The other things that we get a sense of that become really important is the role in which the knight is going to be defending the church. And this defense might include killing others, might include fighting and conflict. So in a sense, there's some degree of justification in the chivalric codes for all of the knightly behavior, which includes a great deal of violence, right? But ultimately, when done on behalf of the Christian church or even on behalf of Christianity, it becomes to some degree just. And even earlier than this chivalric code, there is a concept, almost like a philosophical concept that starts to develop and is written about by church leaders, the idea of just war. When is it justified to fight. And we don't necessarily think of religious institutions as engaging in warfare or fighting, but in this case, we kind of see, in a sense, that that is the role of knights. They are very much involved in defending the church, and the church serves as, in some cases, a motivational aspect for what it is that the knights are doing. And this last one, number 10, being the champion of right and good. How is it that knights are defining kind of right and good? This is kind of in a Christian lens. And so there's a great deal of kind of justification for fighting for right and good, and things that are evil and not become worthy of fighting against, and that is justified in these Chivalric codes. We also see in number 6, thou shalt make war against the infidel. This is kind of suggesting that, you can make war against non-Christians, and this can be done, without mercy. So there is some justification in the work that, knights are doing, and some latitude in a sense, to some degree, that there is a righteousness, to this type of activity. And in some cases, this is reinforced by knights that are called by, leaders of the church, maybe to participate in particular ceremonies at the church before a conflict. So there's a great deal of overlap between the role of the Christian church and the writing of the chivalric codes, and kind of seeing the knights as security guards of the manor, but also very much connected to the church also in a kind of broader sense. And, the idea of loyalty becomes built into these codes. Knight shall remain faithful to the word. And these, an oath for a knight would be taken, kind of in a lens of a ceremonial church type of thing. So there would be some sense that knights would take on this oath, kind of before a higher power. We see this kind of built into a lot of stereotypes that we probably still hold today, in terms of a knight in shining armor, on a white horse, saving a maiden. And, this is evoked in the time period, after the Middle Ages too. This is a painting from 1456 by the artist Uccello, and it speaks to a particular myth about a particular saint. So it is a painting that reflects a story at the time that people would have believed, but kind of comes from this Middle Ages mindset. But we get a sense of some of the stereotypes in this, where we have this, maiden who's literally tied to this evil dragon who looks might be eating her any minute. And out, of nowhere comes this very noble knight, who is going to, bow before her and ultimately save the day. And so this sense of kind of what the knight's role is, and how they kind of are, connected into this Middle Ages society, on some level, is what people believed at the time. But it's also built up through some of the Chivalric Code, and some of the sense of the way in which there is some degree of righteousness built into, a warrior role, which is really kind of at its kind of stripped down level, is really just a warrior who is engaged in conflict. But there is a sense of, righteousness to this, and this question of when fighting is just becomes a very common question in this time period, and people write about it and talk about it, and there's a great deal of perspective on that. Okay, so I will stop there, and in class tomorrow we'll be looking at some materials related to chivalry, but we'll also continue looking at some of the things related to the manner and some of the economy of the Middle Ages. Okay, be well, and I will see you tomorrow.